Thank you so much for your interest in the Severe Weather Shelter Program. This operations training is available as a video for new volunteers, staff, and prior volunteers participating in the program this season. The slides for this presentation, the operations handbook, scheduling instructions, and additional materials can be found on our website at kcowa.us/kcsws. In this training, we are going to talk a little bit about what the Severe Weather Shelter is, what the program does and doesn't do, details of how to open up the shelter, what the shifts are and the responsibilities of each, COVID-19 precautions, and then talk a bit about safety and security. All the information that we are covering in this presentation is also covered in the Severe Weather Shelter Operations Handbook. The handbook is available on our website, and it is also available in the shelter admin kits that are at each of the location. So if you find yourself thinking, gosh, I can't remember exactly what was in the training, there is a manual on hand at the shelter you can use. This is especially helpful in usual situations, or when you need to reference something regarding the rules or procedures of the shelters. The Severe Weather Shelter Program was started a number of years ago out of the need to get more people off the street during really bad weather. We simply don't have enough shelter beds for everybody to be inside all the time. It's important to recognize that the Severe Weather Shelter Program is one of many different strategies that we have here in our county to address homelessness. It's our kind of emergency service backup strategy. It's not ideal, it's not how we wish it was, but it is better than having people dying outside from exposure. This program operates as a collaboration between multiple partners: the Kitsap County Emergency Management Division, the Kitsap County Human Services Housing and Homelessness Division, the hosting organizations, which provide the location for the shelters, and critically important is you, the volunteers that make this program work. We could not operate this program without a huge volunteer effort. Thank you so much. The goal and mission of the Severe Weather Shelter Program is to provide a safe overnight shelter for people who have no place else to come inside during extreme weather conditions. We don't have any restrictions on who can use the shelter. We have families. We have folks who may be fleeing from domestic violence. We might have some runaways, but predominantly you'll be seeing are people who are experiencing homelessness. We don't turn anybody away from the shelter except for behavior-based reasons, which we'll get into in just a minute. But remember, this is not a typical ongoing shelter. It's really only available during severe weather. There are 3 different shelter locations. Each has an agreement with Kitsap County to provide locations for our severe weather shelters. The severe weather shelters are located at Port Orchard United Methodist Church, Silverdale Community Church, and Kingston Village Green Community Center. The structure of the program is in the above chart. The program is managed by the Severe Weather Shelter Committee, made up of representatives from the Housing and Homelessness Division, Department of Emergency Management, site managers at the shelter location, and volunteers participating on the committee. KCDM processes volunteer applications and provides insurance coverages for volunteers through the State Emergency Worker Program. KCDM also is the partner who monitors the weather forecast for the shelters for days when the weather is anticipated meet the criteria to open up the shelters. KCDM is also responsible for providing the shelter admin kits and notifying the press and media about the activation of the shelters. Kitsap County Housing and Homelessness Division, or KCHHD, is responsible for coordinating on a criteria day with the shelter schedulers at each location, providing training to volunteers on general shelter operations. KCHHD is also responsible for being on call for emergencies that cannot be handled by site managers, and convening the Severe Weather Shelter Committee and operations team meetings. KCHHD also is responsible for partnering with 211 to send out text messages to subscribers for text notification alerts when the shelters are open. Very important to the Severe Weather Shelter Program are the shelter site managers. They are responsible for providing the location-specific needs and making sure that the mattresses and pillows are there, and then also making sure that people have access to the shelter site, whether that's keys or access codes to open the shelter. Site managers will be helping you figure out how to get into the building, and they will also be the ones who are teaching you about site-specific rules. Site managers are responsible for having a training for just their facility to make you aware of the specific rules, layouts, and operations at each location. Also very important to the programs are the shelter site volunteer coordinators. These are volunteers designated at each site who are responsible for assisting volunteers to sign up for shifts and assigning volunteers to work in pairs during each shift, as well as helping to troubleshoot scheduling issues. Finally, the most important piece is you, the volunteers. We really could not do this without you. It takes a lot of volunteers to have a shelter staffed through the whole winter season, and if we don't have enough volunteers to cover shifts at a location, we are not able to open that particular shelter. Because you are signing on to work for the Department of Emergency Management under the Emergency Worker Program, you are covered by emergency management insurance, which is awesome. The coverage starts from the time you drive away from your house towards the shelter until the time you get back to the house after you finish your shift. Please remember that while you are working in the shelter, you are a volunteer for Kitsap County Department of Emergency Management. Please act accordingly. Think about yourself as a representative of the county. Volunteers that are part of the Severe Weather Shelter Program may work at any location. Volunteers may have preferences to work across multiple shelters, or they may choose to be dedicated to a single shelter location. Volunteers that work at multiple sites should ensure receive the site-specific training at each location they choose to work. For more information about your role as an emergency management volunteer in the Emergency Management Program, please see WAC 118-04. Volunteers must operate within their training. It's important that we realize our limitations. Our job is to be volunteers at the shelter. We are not there to be doctors or lawyers. Our role is to be friendly when offering a warm place to stay for the night. If you do start exceeding the limits of your shelter training, you can place the whole program in jeopardy and lose your coverage under the Emergency Worker Program. So we encourage you to refer people to other resources to help them in legal issues or financial issues or counseling issues, but don't go beyond your role as a shelter volunteer to provide that information while working in a capacity as a state emergency worker. The shelters are activated when the weather meets certain criteria. The Department of Emergency Management is monitoring the weather during the season in November to March 31st, and whenever, and they determine that the weather meets one of these criteria, they will recommend opening the shelters. The criteria for opening are when the temperature is expected to be 32 degrees or below for 4 hours or more, when snow is expected to exceed 1 inch or more in depth for more than 2 days, or when there are 2 or more successive days exceeding 1 inch or more of rain. The shelters may also be activated when high wind warnings are issued. One of the challenges that our county is really spread out, and so sometimes weather conditions may vary significantly across the county. In one area, temperatures may be freezing, but in other areas, the temps may be several degrees above the criteria to activate. There may be areas that get several inches of snowfall, and areas with none. KCDM reviews the weather forecasts across the county to make a determination about recommending opening the shelters based on the weather criteria. Please also note that the weather reports are based on weather forecasts. These forecasts may have varying levels of confidence, and these predictions may or may not accurately reflect actual weather conditions which occur in the county. In addition to having reports which predict conditions meeting weather criteria, there are additional criteria needed before the shelters can activate. To activate, shelters must additionally fully staff each shift at a location to open that shelter location for the night. Port Orchard and Silverdale shelters will need to staff 3 shifts, each with 2 volunteers. Each shelter location will need 6 volunteers or staff to operate for the night. Kingston requires 6 volunteers plus a cleanup shift. If both the weather conditions are met and the shelter is fully staffed, the shelter will activate. However, if the weather conditions meet criteria, but the shelter is not fully staffed, the shelter will not activate. When KCDM determines that criteria is met to recommend opening the shelters, the shelter coordinator will be contacted with information about the days which meet criteria. Depending on the forecast, this may be 1 day or for several days at a time. After the shelter coordinator is contacted, emails and text messages will be sent out to shelter volunteers at 8 a.m. requesting shift coverage. It is important that you are able to check your email or receive text messages in the morning. An email and message will be sent at 8 or earlier in the morning to shelter volunteers. Volunteers will respond regarding their availability to work shifts during the specified activation period. At 11, shelters report final staffing status. If a shelter is not fully staffed by 11:15, it will not be able to open for that night. A confirmation with your schedule will be sent by email and or text at between 11:30 and noon. A lot of people ask us, why do we have this 11:15 deadline? The primary reason is because we found historically that the most useful and the most effective way to let people who might be guests at the shelter know that the shelters are open is at feeding programs. There are large programs that are offered throughout the county, and if we don't get the word out by lunchtime, a lot of people don't hear about the shelters being open. We want to make sure we have the shelter information available for the lunch programs to announce it. This also gives volunteers and staff enough time to make arrangements to cover their other evening activities, and that other volunteers have time to get the word out to some of the places that advertise about the shelter activations will open so that word spreads as widely as possible. Timeline of a criteria day. If conditions meet the criteria for the severe weather shelter system, KCDM notifies the site volunteer coordinator that the weather is predicted to meet criteria. At 8, shelter coordinator sends notification to volunteers the criteria is met and shelters need staffing. At 11:15, shelter staffing status is reported to KCHHD. At 11:30, volunteers are notified if shelter will activate. At 11:30 to noon, public noticing is sent out by KCDM. Activation notifications will be sent out by KCDM. Flyers are published and emailed out to a variety of organizations, such as KCR, food banks, churches, other social services, and stores. A press release is sent out to all media outlets. Fire, law, hospitals, schools, Kitsap 911, and 211 are also notified. Text alerts are sent out to anyone who signs up by texting Kitsap SWS to 898211. It's super important that if you get that confirmation email that you are scheduled for a shift, that you show up for your shift. Otherwise, the whole thing falls apart, and we struggle when people don't show up for shifts. We also understand that sometimes emergencies come up. For example, your kid becomes sick, or you are stuck across the sound, and you can't get to your shift. We totally understand if that happens, but you are still responsible for getting your shift covered. If issues like emergencies, illness, or other events which would make it impossible or hazardous to work a shift, please reach out to your site manager to discuss the situation. If a backup person is available, you will contact them to see if they can cover your shift. A backup person is a volunteer that has volunteered to be an alternate for the night if someone is not able to make it for their shift. If a backup person is not available, the site manager may be able to recruit another volunteer to work the shift. The most important thing when we are thinking about being volunteers at the shelter is to make sure that the shelters are a safe place. And this training will repeatedly discuss safety, because this is our primary directive, is to provide a safe place to stay. We also really believe deeply in respecting our guests. We're not here to judge them. We're not here to make them do things differently. Our mission is to provide a safe, warm place for people to get out of the weather. We need to provide services equally to all guests. We don't discriminate. Most shelters are open for guests between 6 p.m. and 7 a.m. on days of activation. The exception is for Kingston Village Green, which is limited to 6:30 p.m. 6:30 a.m. for guests. Volunteer coordinators have flexibility in scheduling shifts to meet the needs of their particular shelters. All that is required is that we have 2 volunteers at all times. The typical shift schedule is 3 shifts per night. A 5 to 10 first shift which opens the shelter, a 10 to 3 second shift which monitors overnight, and a third shift 3 to 8 shift which closes in the morning. Kingston, due to their operating hours, has a different 3-shift schedule and an extra person to help with morning cleanup. When you go to the shelter, one of the first things you're going to do as a volunteer is sign in. This is really important. This is how we track who is covered by the emergency worker program. You have to sign in to show that you were there that night. If you're the first person to the shelter, when you get there, you pull out the shelter volunteer sign-in sheet. Write in the date and the mission ID number. This number will be available on a printed calendar and a mail. The sign-in form is pretty straightforward. Write in your name, Your volunteer card number. This can be found on your ID badge, which is issued by KCDM. The date, the time in, and the time out. The time in is the time that you leave your home. The time out is the time you expect to arrive back at home. Emergency worker coverage is active from the time you leave your home until the time you return home, but does not cover additional stops or errands on your way to or from the shelter. In each shelter location, a shelter admin box is provided by the Department of Emergency Management. It includes all kinds of things that are going to help you get through the night, including pens, extra login sheets, the security log, the shelter handbook, cards, flashlights, and emergency lights. Also in the skit you will find community resource information brochures and name tags. Opening the shelter. Now on to the steps to prepare a shelter to open for the night. The general practice is to make sure there's always somebody by the front door, especially during shelter intake time. It's really good to wear name tags. It helps you look a little more official and helps the guests know what to call you and makes it easier for guests and other volunteers to address and interact with one another. Remember that smoking and vaping is generally prohibited in buildings, and it's a good idea to find out where the smoking area is nearest to the building because a lot of guests smoke. And then the last thing is really important, to maintain a logbook. You're responsible for making sure that you continue to communicate with the site manager and the volunteer coordinators if anything comes up or if there is a situation. Make sure that the guests receive updated information about the weather. Make sure that during shift switch over that you talk to the oncoming or outgoing volunteers so that you share information about what's happened while you're on shift. You should also routinely walk around the shelter and make sure the space is safe and sanitary. For the first shift of the night, volunteers arrive on site at 5 p.m. Make sure you have all items needed to open the shelter, such as keys to the facility, lock codes, or other arrangements to have access to the facility. Next, set up the sign-in area at the entrance. Set out hand sanitizer and masks for guests if available. Set up a personal item intake area and make sure you leave enough room for people who might have extra mobility needs. Proceed to setting up the sleeping area. Make sure it looks safe. Set up all the blankets and pillows. Ensure that all beds are spaced at least 6 feet apart in a head-to-toe configuration. Depending on the shelter, there may be a single room to set up, or possibly additional rooms. The site-specific instructions will provide more details about the setup at the site for room use and bed placement. Place signage out to help direct guests to the shelter entrance. Set up the sign-in area near the entrance. Allow for enough room for guests to come in from the weather if possible, but encourage physical distancing at 6 feet apart even if that means some of the line may have to be outside. Set up the personal item intake area near the sign-in desk. Allow enough room for guests who may need extra room for mobility. Set up the sleeping area. Inspect area for safety. Equip each cot or mat with blankets and pillows. Allow enough space for guests to move freely. Before opening the doors to guests, make one more walkthrough of the building. Check the lounge area. Make sure the bathrooms are stocked. Check for safety hazards. And know the exits. When helping guests sign in, read them all of the rules for shelter. This helps us make sure that everybody has heard the rules and understand the rules to the best of their ability. Next, ask for their name, write in the time of arrival, and you also can ask for their age and their sex or gender identity. These additional questions are not a requirement. If they don't want to tell you, they may decline. We use this information only for statistical purposes for the shelter population. Next, you will record the ticket number for their possessions. While we don't require identification, and guests do not have to give us their real name, but it is important that everybody gets signed in, and this is for a couple of reasons. If there's some kind of emergency and you need to evacuate, we need to know how many people were in the shelter as guests, so we may perform a head count. It also helps us keep track of time in and time out, and also makes sure that when the guest enters the shelter that they have acknowledged the rules. Next, we will discuss personal item intake. Pictured here is a large plastic bag. This is not a trash bag. We never ever call this trash bag because people's possessions are being stored in the bag. So you don't want to call it trash. It is a large plastic bag or personal item storage bag. Have the guest place their items in a bag, tape up, or zip tie the top of the bag. Write guest's name on tape for identification. Once bag is sealed, it may not be opened until checkout. We want to be really clear that we don't get to touch other people's stuff without them requesting our assistance. If a guest asks for help with bagging items, you can assist. Give the guest the ticket, and the other half is attached to the outside of the bag. It's really important when you're talking to guests about the large possession bag that they are aware that once it is sealed, that no one will be able to get into the bag until checkout the following morning. When guests leave in the morning, they must take their belongings with them. Personal item intake and storage overnight aids in keeping the facility secure, helps with disease control, and helps to make sure the shelter rules are followed. It's really important to let people know this so that if they have some small items that they need to have with them overnight, they should keep out items they will need overnight, such as cell phones, hygiene items, computers, music players, stuffed animals, at your discretion, and religious items. It's really important to let people know this so that if they do have some small items that they need to have with them overnight, these may be placed in smaller Ziploc bags to keep with them in the shelter. We don't want people to have purses or backpacks with them. It just gets into an issue of people being concerned about security. We have a really strict rule about guests arriving after check-in time ends at 9 p.m. One reason is for safety. Our experience is that guests that come in after 9 p.m. have been disruptive to other guests. We need to make a determination if anybody is going to show up for the night. If no guests show up by the end of check-in time, our experience has shown us that guests have likely made other arrangements. If there are no guests by the 9 p.m. check-in time, then the shelter closes for the night. The first shift volunteers will notify the site manager, KCHHD on-call person, the volunteers on the following shifts, and Kitsap 911 about the closure. First shift volunteers then put away gear, clean up, lock up, and leave for the night. There are a couple exceptions to the 9 p.m. check-in rule. We do have an agreement with law enforcement and emergency services that they are allowed to bring in guests after 9 p.m. if they find someone outside needing shelter. Guests that are accompanied by law enforcement can be allowed into the shelter. The other exception is that the site manager may allow an after 9 p.m. arrival if there is a legitimate reason that the guest cannot make it to the shelter by 9 p.m. Lights out should be out at 10 p.m. The doors should be locked and anything non-essential should be shut off. Offer one last smoke break around 9:40 p.m. before locking up at 10 p.m. After lights out, perform a security check of the premises. People might want to keep their music players on to listen to music or something similar. That's fine as long as they're not bothering other people. It's not our job to police or make people sleep. It's our job to make sure that if people want to have 8 hours of sleep, they're able to have 8 hours of sleep. Honestly, a lot of those who are living outside are really happy to have a good day's sleep, which is hard to get outdoors. Guests are not allowed out of the facility after lights out. This is for both your safety and the safety of our guests. The exception is if a guest has a service animal that needs to be taken out after 10 p.m. If a guest leaves the shelter after lights out, they are not permitted back in until 6 p.m. the following day, if the shelter is still active. Guests must take their belongings with them if they leave after 10 p.m. We cannot store their belongings until the following night. You make this rule really hard and fast with folks, and be strict with this policy, or this will encourage boundary pushing and problems if you make a lot of exceptions. Special circumstances may be considered, and exceptions may be made depending on the situation. You do have some discretion, and there might be some special circumstances in which you make an exception to this rule, but we really advise you to do it very judiciously. People will try to push and bend these rules as much as they can. You have to be firm with the rules. You can say, "I'm so sorry. These are the rules. I didn't make the rules. I have to follow the rules. I'm so sorry we can't let you back in after 10 p.m. We're not the guards, and this is not a jail. Not everyone will be able to sleep, but they will be given the opportunity for a full 8 hours of rest. We just make sure that guests can rest if they want to." Volunteers from the first shift will brief the second shift volunteers about what occurred since opening for the night. Please make sure to inform the oncoming shift of any incidents, supplies, or facility issues, or other information that the next shift needs to know. Overnight, the second shift will maintain the logbook, make hourly rounds to ensure the safety of the shelter facility and guests, perform late check-ins if guests are brought by emergency services. Site managers may approve an after 9 p.m. arrival for guests if there is a legitimate reason. Finally, at the end of the shift, provide turnover keys and information to the next oncoming shift. The closing shift's responsibility will be monitoring the shelter through the night, then getting guests up, checking guests out, cleaning, and locking up in the morning. At 6, volunteers will begin waking people up and letting people know that they need to be out of the shelter by 7. Make sure every guest signs out and takes their possessions with them. Depending on your shelter, you may collect dirty linens for washing or leaving beds made. This depends on the rules for the shelter location. Once the guests have been given their belongings and exited the shelter by 7, the third shift volunteers are responsible for cleaning up the shelter. Follow your site-specific instructions and work to clean and disinfect the shelter. We want to be good partners with the host sites, which are kind enough to let us have our programs there, so we want to leave it better than we found it. Make sure you sign out and organize paperwork. Figure out how to get the keys returned. Once you are done cleaning and stowing items, lock up the shelter again for the following night. You should finish between 7:30 and 8. Shelter must close daily at 7, with the exception of rare events where severe weather conditions lead to an extension of the shelter closing time. At 6, volunteers will begin waking people up and letting people know that they need to be out of the shelter by 7. Make sure every guest signs out and takes their possessions with them, even if they plan on returning the following night. Once guests have all exited, the volunteers or staff will follow the site-specific instructions to clean up, disinfect, and close the shelter. This is expected to take from 30 minutes up to 1 hour. While guests are claiming their belongings, they will need to present their ticket so that you may match the appropriate possessions bag to the guest. If a guest has lost or misplaced their ticket, assist other guests in checking out. The leftover bag should belong to the guest that has misplaced their ticket. Guests must take all of their possessions when they leave the shelter. Even if guests plan on retuning the next night, the shelter did not have the capacity to store a guest's belongings. Keep the ticket stub. Write down the time the guest checks out. If a guest refuses to sign out, volunteers should write time out and note the circumstances in the security log. Once guests have all exited at 7 a.m., ensure that the building is empty and secured. Complete any remaining paperwork. Clean up any areas used, such as bathrooms or common areas. Make a last round through building. Lock up building, return key or place back in key box, depending on location. Make sure you check the restrooms regularly. Make sure that they have all the paper products that they need. Also check, because sometimes people like to smoke in the bathrooms or engage in other drug use. Smoking is not allowed inside the shelter facilities. You can direct guests out to the nearest smoking area. If there are any spills or hazardous things, make sure you clean these up as soon as possible. It can be really dangerous for people who could trip and fall, especially those who might happen to have mobility issues. If there's any minor equipment things that come up, such as clogged toilets or other minor problems you can fix by hand, please go ahead and do that you can. If the issue is more than a minor issue, contact your site manager, and they will help to contact maintenance or troubleshoot the issue. To not put yourself in danger. We have a really generous community, and a lot of times people hear about the severe weather shelter programs and want to make a donation. That is wonderful, and we really are excited about community members wanting to help. Certain items, such as single-serve prepackaged snacks, toilet paper, hygiene products may be accepted. If it is something large, or a lot of donations you don't think you can handle, refer them to contact the shelter site manager during normal business hours. However, if it is something like cash or prepared food, you cannot accept these items. Under no circumstances can you, as a volunteer, accept financial donations or checks. Provide the contact information for the site manager and ask them to call during regular business hours. Our job is to provide a safe, warm shelter for people, not necessarily to feed people, as this is not a feeding program. However, on some of the shelters have decided that they want to offer some snacks or prepackaged items. It is not the shelter volunteer's job to be serving or feeding people. We had a situation out in the past where volunteers have had a lot of empathy and compassion for folks who are struggling, and once offered to give a ride either to go get something in the evening or a ride somewhere in the morning. This voids your shelter worker insurance. We really can have volunteers risking this program and this coverage. This is very important. What you do on your own time after you clock out is your choice, but while you're volunteering, do not give shelter guests a ride before, after, or during your shift. Guests in need of a ride to, or from, the severe weather shelters may call Gather Together Grow Together to 360-373-3000 to arrange for a ride. We also don't write letters of verification saying that somebody is homeless. There are places that can do this for folks, such as the Housing Solutions Center, that can perform assessments, intake, and referral to housing programs. These offices are located throughout the county. This information is available in the resource guides in the admin kits. One of the questions that comes up the most is about animals in the shelters. It's an interesting question that has become such an issue of confusion. Some Washington state laws are helpful to clarify and understand what we can and can't do regarding animals in shelters. The first thing to understand is that you can think of it as 3 different kinds of animals that might show up with guests at the shelter. First, you have pets. Next are animals for emotional support, which are companion animals. Lastly, you have service animals. Pet and emotional support therapy animals are not allowed in shelters unless the shelter location makes a decision to do that, and to have specific rules about how to do that. We're not going to address pets and emotional support therapy animals, as this is outside of the scope of this program. We understand that pets are people's family, but the blanket decision to not allow pets in the shelters was made because it comes with a whole host of management issues. As stated, the specific site may allow other rules regarding pets at their particular location. Regarding service animals, there are laws in Washington state that say that we cannot discriminate against people who have service animals. Please note that service animals are welcome in all of the shelters. Interestingly, service animals are specifically defined as dogs or miniature horses. That's it. If someone comes to the shelter with a different kind of animal and tell you that it is a service animal, you can be sure that it is not true. Service animals are defined as being specially trained to help their owners in some specific way, but the law doesn't specifically define what training means. It doesn't say what kind of training, but it does have to be above and beyond the obedience training that most owners work with their animals to achieve. Service animals are not required to have any documentation. You might see some people with paperwork or training jackets. However, service animals are not required to provide any identification, and they are not required to wear service vests. You might be wondering if an animal is a service animal, and we have very specific rules about what we can ask people to try to determine this as a service animal. We can't ask people about the person's disability or ask that they prove that they have a disability. It might be something that we can't see or we don't perceive. The 2 questions that you can ask are, is this animal a pet? If they say yes, that this is a pet, and they are not allowed in the shelter. If the person says this is a service animal, the second question you are allowed to ask is, what is this animal trained to do for you? If the person doesn't answer or refuses, they do not need to be admitted to the shelter. If the person tells you I have such and such disability, but does not tell you what the animal is trained to do, you do not have to admit them to the shelter. If they hand you a piece of paper that says this is a certified service animal, it's probably fake. There are no certifications, no registries, no defined list of documentation for service animals. If someone does hand that to you, you can let them know the documentation probably isn't valid. When you ask the question, what is this animal trained to do for you? And the person says, oh, they can sit and stand and lie, or to basically anything else that falls into the realm of obedience training, but they don't mention anything that specifics about how the animal helps them, then the animal can be excluded. Also, if they describe something that is reassuring to them, or eases depression, or keeps them company as a companion, that is a wonderful thing, but it is also not a specific task or services the animal is doing for the person, and so they can be excluded. However, if they do answer that the animal is trained to guide them, or help them with balance, or remind them to do things, to take medication, or stabilizing them during the seizure, that kind of thing that's very specific, then chances are that it is a trained service animal, and we do allow them in our shelters. You can't discriminate in any way against as a person who has a service animal. They have to be allowed into all of the same areas that all the other guests are allowed. Although if you have the ability and the room available, you are welcome to set them up a separate space, but you can't require them to use it. It's really important to make sure that everybody understands that the guests have to have their animals under control at all times. Service animals are incredibly well trained, and if you have an animal that is running around not under the control, then you can guess that the animal is probably not a service animal. You can ask the guest to please keep the animal under control because if they're disturbing other people. Sometimes we do have folks come into the shelters that have mobility issues or hearing impairments or physical impairments. Sometimes there may be things going on with people, and they may be responding to us in ways that are different than we expect. Again, the idea is to treat everyone with respect. Try to explain what you want to get across to them. Try to have patience, and try to expect the best of people. Please note that while rare, there may be instances where you may suspect or see sign of child or vulnerable adult abuse. As a volunteer, there are 2 important facts that you need to know. First, severe weather shelter volunteers and WA state emergency workers are not mandated reporters. Second, being homeless is not a reason for Child Protective Services to remove a child. The only reason for CPS to remove a child is if they believe the child is in danger of imminent harm or is being neglected. This training will not go into deep detail about reporting abuse. Information sheets regarding identifying and reporting child or vulnerable adult abuse are provided in the admin kits. These materials include criteria for reporting abuse, phone numbers to contact, and information that need to be collected to make a report. Working with the media doesn't happen a lot, but every once in a while newspaper will decide they want to write a story about the shelters, which is wonderful. We love that, and it is newsworthy, but we have to protect the privacy of our guests. They didn't come here to be interviewed on film, so you need to check in with the guests to make sure that their privacy is protected, they feel safe, and not compelled to do anything. If talking to reporters makes you feel uncomfortable, you can refer them to the shelter site manager or refer them to the shelter coordinator. It's helpful if you do have requests from reporters to let us know who you talk to and what news outlet they're from, just that we keep our eyes open for the coverage. Any camera activity inside the shelter is really discouraged. Again, we want to protect people's privacy, and when a camera crew shows up, they will likely be very respectful. If some of the guests want to talk to them and share their story, that is fine, but we do want to respect their right to not participate if they do not want to. We understand that it is really hard to turn people back outside at 7 in the morning when it's still dreadfully cold, or snowing, or raining, or windy. We want to make sure that you have the resources to help refer people to other shelter and housing programs after they leave. These resources can be found in the shelter admin kit. We include the Sally's resource guides for guests. This is a 4-page guide which provides a list of all kinds of resources and places that people can go who are experiencing homelessness, or housing instability, or need help with something related to housing. The first call we always recommend to anyone experiencing homelessness is to call the Housing Solutions Center. The Housing Solutions Center is our county's one-stop intake for housing resources, so anybody who's having trouble paying the rent, or about to get evicted, or living on the streets and needs help should call. This is their sole purpose, to be a single one-stop place to get people connected with the resources that they need. They have offices all over the county in Bremerton, Port Orchard, Poulsbo, and Bainbridge Island. There is also a brochure which shows all of the meal sites that are offered throughout the county every day of the week. Shelter safety and security is everyone's responsibility. This is our number one value. Our number one directive is to make sure that everybody, our volunteers, our guests, and our facilities are safe. We can't emphasize enough, when in doubt, choose the safest option. You might have situations come which you may feel are beyond what you feel comfortable making a decision about. That occasionally happens. Most of the things we think you'll be able to manage yourselves with some common sense and safety sense. But if you do have a medical emergency or some kind of serious incidents or altercations, or the building gets damaged, then it's time to reach out and contact somebody higher up the chain. The first call you are going to make is if any of those things happen is to the site manager. The site manager's phone number the back of the operations handbook in the admin kit. They are the first line of defense when you run along a question or issue that you don't know how to answer. If the site manager is not available or if they don't know the answer, the next call is going to be to the KCHHD on-call person. Again, this number is in the back of the operations handbook. If there's any kind of a situation where you feel like there's any threats of people's lives or you feel like there is an unsafe situation, please call 911. Don't hesitate. Probably when you call the site manager or on-call in these situations, their answer is going to be calling 911. You are going to need to let your site manager know and write it down in the security log. But in the middle of that emergency situation, we really suggest calling 911. For non-emergency situations where it seems that perhaps a guest may be having a hard time or distressed, you can offer to have a guest call and talk to the crisis line, which can provide crisis intervention and a supportive listening ear over the phone. This number is available 24 hours per day and is available in the back of the operations handbook. As we talked about, doors should be locked at 10 p.m. Nobody should come or go from the facility after the doors are locked unless a guest is being delivered by law enforcement. Then do your rounds and make sure the building is safe. Sometimes during severe weather that can compromise the building, right? Maybe it is raining so much that it is flooding. It's better that we know about this earlier than later. That's why we have you do the security rounds to check that the building is still in good shape. Sometimes snow might be accumulating against the doors, so it can help to keep that cleared away. The shelter security log really important, and we require that everything is logged in it so that we have a really clear record of what's happening in the shelters. You will record the date, time, and any unusual incidents. You will keep a record of vehicles in the parking lot as best you can, and then write down your regular security rounds. For example, you might write the date and time with as specific information as you can about the vehicles in the parking lot. Or there was an altercation, you all had a fight, and we had to call 911, or a guest left unexpectedly. The more detailed the better. Include as detailed and specific information as available. This is very important to help us review and address incidents that come up. Avoid incomplete entries. For example, if you were to write 3 vehicles in the parking lot, that is not descriptive. It doesn't give license number of color, make, or model. If you were to write that there was a fight among 2 guests, that doesn't tell us who, why, or what the resolutions was. For another example, if you wrote that a guest got mad and left early, that doesn't tell us which guest, why they were mad, or why did they leave. Remember, we are not law enforcement. We are also not lawyers, counselors, or doctors. As volunteer, we have a limited role specific to the operation of this program. You do not have the right to physically search any person or their belongings. Do not touch a guest's personal items. Unless assistance is requested, you can help by holding a personal item bag open for them or give it to them, but don't touch any of their personal items unless they specifically ask you to. You are permitted to do a visible search for weapons or contraband. You can look a person up and down, and if you see a bulge, you can ask them if they have a weapon. If the power goes out, in some places in the county this happens a lot, in other places not so much. When the power goes out, everybody stay where you are. It doesn't mean that the shelter has to close instantly. Some buildings have safety lights and generators that come on, some may not. There are flashlights and emergency lights included in the shelter admin kit. As long as the building is safe, you know you can have people stay there. It's better than being outside. But we do suggest that if you or a guest wants to go to the bathroom or walk around, then make sure they have a flashlight. Fires in shelters as the real thing that happens, and it's a really big security and safety concern. This is another reason to do regular rounds. We know it's tempting to just sit there and kind of hang out, read a good book, or play solitaire, but we really do want you to be checking on the building because shelter fires are real and can be deadly. One of the things that you should do when you first start training in the building is figure out where the fire extinguishers are located. To use a fire extinguisher, you can follow the acronym PAS for pull, aim, squeeze, and sweep. You will pull the pin on the fire extinguisher, aim the nozzle at the base of the flame, pull the trigger, and sweep the spray back and forth across the fire. At the same time, the other volunteer that is working with you is going to be on the phone to 911 reporting the fire. For any kind of a fire, you will always call 911. In the unlikely event of an earthquake, you're going to drop, cover, and hold. This is what you do in any location. Sometimes the quakes are minor enough that the building has not suffered any damage, and you can just continue on. But if the building is damaged, you are going to need to safely evacuate. Make sure that the safety exits are clear. The shelter is now closed. Make sure guests take all of their belongings. Then exit the building to a designated area. Make sure you take the logbook and sign-in sheets. Do a roll call or head count to make sure that everybody got out of the building. Then you can contact the shelter site manager. Chances are that big of an earthquake would damage the building that you're in, and there's going to be a lot of other havoc everywhere else around the county as well. We will do our best to get you the help that you need. Sit tight outside of the building until you get further instructions. This might seem obvious, but weapons are not allowed in shelters. You cannot physically search people, but you can ask them if they have a weapon. If you see something suspicious, ask them if that is a weapon, and then explain to the guest that they are not allowed to carry weapons around, but they are welcome to place it in their possession bag until the next morning. We can't confiscate things from guests, but you can ask them to keep weapons in their possessions bags, which they can take with them when they leave. If you have a guest with a weapon and they seem unwilling to give it up, remember safety first. Avoid a confrontation. Explain this policy on weapons. Again, you can blame the program for these rules. You didn't make the rules, but you do have to follow them. Let them know that weapons can cause a lot of issues and make the shelter unsafe, and explain that they can keep them in their possessions bag, or you will have to ask them to leave. Then if the guest refuses to follow the rule or leave, definitely call 911. We do have the ability to trespass people, which means they're basically prohibited from being on the premises. This is typically for repeat offenders and will be done with your shelter site managers and law enforcement. There is a certain form that we use, and there are a few people who have been trespassed from certain sites. Their behavior is just such that they are not able to be in a space with other guests harmoniously, and may be verbally or physically abusive to volunteers, and so we say you can't come on this site anymore. Most people are happy to have a place to stay and are willing to follow the rules. However, if you do have an issue with someone who is causing problems, make sure that these incidents are detailed in the security log. We can then use these logs to determine if the guest needs help and a change of tactics, or to be trespassed from the facility. Volunteers are also not allowed to carry weapons of any kind while serving in the shelter. Kitsap County rules for employees prohibits allow anyone to have weapons while on the job. Drug and alcohol use is also not permitted in the shelters. If people come in and they have drugs, again, it's not your job confiscated it or to tell them that they shouldn't do drugs or call law enforcement necessarily. You are not allowed to confiscate illegal drugs or medication. That's not your responsibility. If they're willing to put it away in their possessions bag for the night, they can take their belongings away with them in the morning. Of course, prescription medications are allowed. Drug or vitamins. It is hard to tell. Sometimes you can't tell what is a drug, or a vitamin, or a medication. It is important to recognize that some people may have diabetes and require insulin. So just because you find that someone has needles doesn't necessarily mean that they are an IV drug user. They need those needles for insulin. You can ask to see the insulin bottle and verify that it says insulin on it. If they refuse to show the bottle to you, they can stow it away in their possessions bag overnight. Insulin medications should say insulin somewhere on the bottles, and guests can keep these items with them if they need to take it overnight or in the morning. Use your best judgment in regards to medication. If the bottle is obviously past expiration date on it, if there are different colored pills inside, you can ask the guest to stow their medication in their possessions bag overnight. Use your common sense. Again, avoid confrontation and explain the shelter policy. If the guest refuses, you can ask them to leave the shelter. You are not a drug counselor. You don't have to judge them. This is about keeping the shelter safe. If there is a repeated issue with this, make sure that it is documented in detail in the security log. Pretty rare for there to be physical altercations. It's not your job to break it up. You're pretty much going to call 911 right away. You want to leave some space around the folks who are fighting and stay out of their way and keep other guests away. We want to give a huge thank you to all of you. We could not do this without you. One thing I will say is that while we need volunteers desperately, we need volunteers who actually are going to work shifts. Think carefully about what your ability is to participate in this program. We would love to have you volunteer, but we also understand if something happens, then it makes you feel like this isn't for me. There's lots of other ways you can get involved in our community with homelessness or other social services and other ways to help people. Think for yourself by what you want to do, and we would love to have you join our program and help us to assist people with a safe place to stay during severe weather. Thank you for your help and for making Kitsap County a great community.